There's a lot to learn when you're studying a musical instrument, and there are a lot of things that need regular practice, like tunes, scales, technique, reading, time, listening. But the problem is that music lessons are short and there's a lot of stuff to fit in, and usually there's not enough time to fit into a lesson. Most music lessons are short, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe an hour if you're lucky. But apart from absolute beginners, there's not usually enough time in a lesson to cover everything a developing musician actually needs to be working on. Now, it's not a problem with teaching, it's just the reality of learning music. When you learn an instrument, you're juggling a lot of parallel skills at once. Fingerings and positions, patterns like scales and arpeggios and chords, sight reading and improvising if you're doing jazz, comping, groove, time, feel, rhythm by eye and by ear. And that's before we even talk about repertoire, learning tunes, learning melodies, learning heads. There's a lot of stuff to cover. There's a lot to go over. There's a lot that you need to learn. There's a lot that goes into learning music. So a challenge is that teachers just don't have time to address all of that stuff in every single lesson. They have to prioritize. And the trap for students, especially young students and their parents, is assuming that if something doesn't come up in the lesson, it doesn't need attention that week or even any more. But that's a misconception. It's a misunderstanding. Look, if you've got a 30-minute lesson each week, that's barely enough time for much more than just a check-in, really, and for the teacher to just listen to a couple of things. Working on even one piece in any depth at all, that can easily take the whole lesson. But just because your teacher doesn't go over all your scales that week doesn't mean that they've stopped being a thing, right? They still need to be practiced. Even if your teacher looks at a couple of your scales, there's still all the others, they still exist. Teachers usually do give students guidance about what they should be practicing. Good teachers do. But students too often ignore, and their parents ignore, they ignore that and they ignore what they're supposed to be doing between lessons. And they fall back on honestly weak excuses like, but you didn't write it in my notebook this week. Outsourcing responsibility in that kind of way, it's just more likely to lead to disappointment than to progress. And there's one more important idea related to this, and that is that just because you or your student or your child, if you're a parent, just because you've moved on from something in a lesson or in lessons doesn't mean that it's finished. Music that you've studied, scales that you've done in the past, they don't stop being a thing. They don't disappear. You keep learning them, you keep working on them, they become part of your skill set. As a musician, you should be building a repertoire of tunes that you actually know, and growing a tree of skills that stays alive over time and grows over time. So lesson time by itself is usually not enough, but what matters is what happens between the lessons and the responsibility that you or your students take. In the next video, I want to show you a really practical way to keep alive one of those skills, and that is scales. I'll show you a way of practicing it around the cycle of fourths so that you're playing them in all 12 keys. I'll be demonstrating that on the guitar, but it works for any instrument. That's coming next.